Our conversation today is with the renowned Professor Tania Murray Li. She's professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto in Canada, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in the Political Economy and Culture of Asia. Her publications include Powers of Exclusion, Land Dilemmas in Southeast Asia. She co-authored this book with Derek Hall and Philip Hirsch. Other book is called The Will to Improve, Governmentality, Development and Practice of Politics, and Transforming the Indonesian Uplands, Marginality, Power and Production. Her recent book, published in 2014, is called Lands and Capitalist Relation on an Indigenous Frontier. It's also on Indonesia. This book has generated a lot of interest among scholars and social movements. In this conversation, we're going to precisely talk about Lands End book. Professor, I'm honored to be talking to you and thank for accepting talking to me. Can you briefly tell us about the Lands End book? What are the key findings and arguments?
Okay, so this book is the result of a long period of research, really a 20-year period during which I tracked really a remarkable set of transformations in a relatively remote corner of Indonesia, in which during this period highland farmers who were indigenous to the area, not migrants, people who'd already lived in this highland area, started to engage with global markets in a different way. They had previously planted cash crops, but they planted cocoa. And in the context of doing that, they set off a really major transformation, the privatization of land, because cocoa is a perennial, comes together with private land rights, individual land rights, and also a process of class polarization among themselves, which of course they had not anticipated. Mm-hmm. So the interest of the story, I mean, there's several elements. One is that a lot of the discussion around indigenous people imagines them as very committed to conserving customary forms of communal land tenure and so on. But the historical record in Indonesia and in other parts of the world is that sometimes these customary institutions are not very strongly institutionalized, and they're really a feature of an open land frontier, in which it's not necessary to pin down land relations very tightly because land is abundant. So what I show is really that period, is why I called it Land's End, in which people went from land abundance to land being scarce, land being privately owned, and being a commodity which was bought and sold, and the massive social transformation that comes together with that. So in a way, it's the story that Marx tells, that Lenin tells about differentiation among the peasantry. The surprise for many people is that a differentiation like this would happen in such a remote place. And you imagine that if you go to these areas, people can manage their market relations, they can sustain food production alongside cash crop, they can balance market and ecological risk. But basically they can engage with markets from a position of strength and opportunity. What I show is actually how these kinds of market relations can very quickly encompass them and become really dominant in how they are able to organize their relationships with the land and with each other. Mm-hmm. Not because you choose to be a greedy capitalist, but because that's the form that relations take. Once land is private and scarce, you either use it and manage it efficiently, or you're going to lose it to the guy next door who might be your brother, but if he is successful in expanding his farm, and you are unsuccessful and getting into debt, sooner or later, he's going to end up with your land, right? Mm-hmm. So it's recording that dynamic, how, in one sense, one could say one had enclosure from below, the privatization of land, not as a grab from above, but as a process from below, and also kind of capitalist relations from below. Not something which arrived like a steamroller from the outside, but something which was instilled among the people. Not that they chose capitalist relations, they just chose to plant cocoa. Mm-hmm. And it had all of these consequences. So that's the theme of the book, and why it might have resonance in different parts of the world where similar kinds of transformations are.
We can still say that it was a compulsory choice, so to speak.
Well, I would say at the beginning it was a choice in the sense that they chose to plant cocoa. But, no one... Why did they make this choice? Well, you could say because they were tired of being poor and backward. They said, here we are, we have been abandoned, the government does nothing for us, the people on the coast despise us and treat us as backward people because our clothes are ragged. So it was a choice, but it was a choice which was shaped by the social, material conditions and also the cultural evaluations. They said, we want to change this. We want to be people like ordinary villagers, who can go to the market looking normal, not looking ragged and poor. But initially it was a choice, but what I show is over time how choices eroded. Initially they said, of course we'll maintain food alongside cocoa. What farmer would not have a field full of corn or cassava or something to eat? But as their land became more and more squeezed and more scarce, they really didn't have enough space to do both. So if you try to maintain food production when you really don't have enough land, pretty soon your productivity will go down and you can't sustain yourself. By trying to plant more of the higher value crop, they hope to make enough money to buy food. So at that point you could say choice is eroded. At this point you make the inefficient choice to plant food and you end up without any land. You make
any food.
And any food as well, right? If you make the efficient choice, try more cocoa, and if you can make a go of it, you can feed your farm, feed your family, right? And I actually watched this playing out over 20 years as people I knew made different choices. Some of them lost their land and some of them prospered. What was unique was following it all the way along, for 20 years. So I think when stories are told about agrarian differentiation, they're often rather, I always think they're kind of full of wooden men. It's like the landlord, the landless person, as if they are not people. So because I knew these people and could follow their struggles, their dilemmas, their doubts, what do you do when your sister next door has no food and she's coming to you saying, my children are hungry, give me something? And you, as a landholder, might say, of course I must help my sister. But then your wife is saying, if you help her every day, soon we too will be destitute, right? So people have to make difficult decisions. There are many dilemmas as a process of class polarization takes place among the people. This is not a simple matter, right? And so how this is negotiated culturally, how people make sense of it, how they justify their decisions they make. That's the kind of thing that this type of ethnographic inquiry can expose.
This takes us to the issue of food sovereignty. In fact, you published an article, the Journal of Peasant Studies, where you question whether there can be food sovereignty there in large highlands of the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. Are you seem to show the challenges of the concept of food sovereignty, and you argue that in the case of that place, food sovereignty fails to resonate. Are you completely skeptical to the idea of food sovereignty as such, or you are suggesting that the concept should be more flexible and incorporate other elements?
So I think, as a national campaign, for example, the idea that, a nation shouldn't have food dumped upon it, shouldn't have unfair trade rules. Like, as a campaign, as it initially started in relation to the WTO and the idea that, nations should have some control over their food production systems, that seems to me to make perfect sense. But when you go down to the local level, the question of whether every rural producer can be or should be growing their own food, that I would doubt, because it really depends on your ecological conditions. If you're in a peri-urban area, maybe you can have a lovely organic farm and grow all kinds of vegetables, you can sell city people who can afford to spend a little more for a nice quality product. But if you live up a mountain in the middle of nowhere, how many tomatoes can you sell on market day? You can only sell them in the local market and you'll soon crash the price. And so, ironically, remote people are sometimes better off with a global market crop like cocoa, because it's much harder to crash the global cocoa market than it is to crash the local market for tomatoes, right? Mm-hmm. So, this question of what is actually going to make sense for people given their ecological condition, given their geographic condition. Also in relation to food, these people were growing food. When I first knew them in 1990, they were all growing rice, corn, cassava. The problem was that they are in an El Nino afflicted area, and every 4 to 7 years, their crops failed completely. And so they did not look to the past as a time of food abundance. They looked at it as an erratic time. In a good year, we had so much food we didn't know what to do with it. In a bad year, it was famine, and it was extremely scary. And many people live under conditions like that, right? So you could say that having money and being able to buy food seemed to the highlanders much more secure, much safer, than depending on what they could grow themselves, given that it was erratic, right? Mm-hmm. So, the idea that people are safer and more sovereign and more in control when they grow their own food, under some conditions, yes. Under other conditions, no. They're highly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So that's a question of the conjuncture. It's a question of the situation that people are in. Yeah. So it's not an ideological opposition to the concept. It's more a question of, would that resonate? If some activist came to the Highlands saying, we think you should grow food, they would say, young man or young woman, just try it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Given the kind of land we have, that's really a hard life.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that this will be my last question. One of the crucial elements of an academic work or writing is the issue of impact, right? Mm-hmm. I know that your book generated a lot of interest, as I said before, among scholars, but also readers from outside the scholarship. How do you evaluate the responses on your book? Did you get criticisms, particularly from scholar activists or social movements, for kind of, highlighting issues that may be contradictory to what they write, they say, or they campaign for?
I don't know. In my experience, activists know all this stuff. There's nothing new here. So I think there is a distinction between like a campaign platform and the knowledge that people often have, especially if they work close to the ground. They actually know that these processes of polarization, the fragility of many kinds of farming systems is not news. Mm-hmm. The question is it strategic or not to expose this stuff? So that's where probably I would differ with some of the activists. So if your idea is that in order to have a successful campaign, you have to produce a strong image of the kind of the proudly self-sufficient peasant community. My question would be, not that never exists, but to ask, under what conditions can this kind of figure exist? What kinds of support do they need? What kinds of state subsidy? What kinds of transportation? What kinds of market, right? Not to say this is an impossible figure, but just to say you can't make this figure stand in for the whole. So your movement has to account for and be able to accommodate the range of kinds of ways that people are living on the land. And if you can do that, your movement will be stronger, not weaker, right? Because it's not pegging everything on one exaggerated image. So, as I said in our discussions yesterday, sometimes this is put in terms of strategic essentialism. It's strategic to have a simplified model. And my question is it really strategic? Or is it actually going to undermine the movement? Because so many people will not see themselves in this picture. It will not fit their reality. And so they will not be part of this movement because they will say, it's not for us. Right? It doesn't represent us. It cannot help us. It has nothing to offer us. All they're talking about is how you should all grow your own food. Like I said, try it, Try living up here with us, right? So I think there's a way in which, critical scholarship like this can be seen as a contribution, you know, in the sense that it puts in the center of debate one of the kinds of reality a movement has to wrestle with. It's not everything, not everywhere is like this. I've highlighted one set of processes and dilemmas, other studies would highlight others. But, you know, a strong farmer movement has to deal with the whole range. And so I don't see it as hostile to the movement, but I do see it as a kind of a call to kind of a reality check in some ways, and also a sort of a reconnection with the diverse range of farming systems.
The Indonesian Peasants Union, SPI, responded to your book formally or informally. I know that you have connections with Harry Saragi, for example.
Right. Actually, I don't know. I mean, I do know Harry, but not very well. No, I mean, but that is not really a big movement, right? And it's not present anywhere in Sulawesi. I mean, I think this is a problem of a movement which claims to represent a very large constituency, but is highly regional, specific, maybe certain groups of people that are affiliated. But no one I know in any where I've ever worked in rural Indonesia has ever heard of SPI, right? In general, Indonesia is not very well organized, right? Indonesian farmers do not have strong peasant unions. There isn't a strong peasant movement in the country as a whole. I'm not saying there aren't pockets where movements have been active, movements of different kinds. So, you know, it wouldn't be their specific response I would think about, but more broadly, you know, the range of people who are working on agrarian issues, whether in the Indigenous Peoples Movement, the Food Sovereignty Movement, maybe SPI, others. A lot of people thinking about land reform, land tenure. I mean, I think the book has a contribution to a range of kind of political and activist positions, and it's being translated into Indonesian. I think almost all my work is being translated. I make it a point of principle to try to have work translated, because otherwise it seems not fair, right? A foreigner comes in and then they run away with their book and no one gets to read it or discuss it. So that's something that when the Indonesian translation comes out, I would hope to have further discussions.
In fact, your next book will be on palm oil in the plantations in Indonesia. Why palm oil, and if I may ask, what can we expect from it?
So that's it's a different field site, still in Indonesia, but a very different set of issues. There it is the more familiar story of the large-scale corporate land-grabbing kind of thing. You know, the surprise in some ways is that the people don't necessarily resist the corporate agriculture. Again, one could say it's sort of a coerced choice in the sense that they want the roads and the infrastructure. Because the state is not providing those things, they are told that only if they join in a partnership, as it's called, with a company, can they have these things. So, you know, a different set of powers, a different set of processes. What's of concern to me, particularly with that study, what I'm trying to do is really an ethnography of the plantation. Mm-hmm. So, whereas a lot of the literature on large-scale farming and plantations so far has focused on what's being taken away, like land rights, diverse agricultural systems, food production, biodiversity, etc. I'm trying to focus on what's being installed. Not just the palms, but the social and political relations which go together with large-scale corporate agriculture. So that's a whole political nexus involving politicians, government officials, corporations, workers. They're tied into a new kind of knot. Mm-hmm. And in Indonesia, there's already 10 million hectares of corporate oil palm. So in my estimation, there's at least 10 million people that are already living the plantation life, you know, in the sense that their access to land, food, work, political process, everything is tied up with the plantation. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to study. That's what I'm working on.
Professor, once again, thank you for talking to me. I wish you all the best in your academic journey, and thank you to our audience for watching.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.